Greetings, friends of liberty. Just one further sip from this exquisite Darjeeling. Truly extraordinary. And I shall then transition into my American accent to practice so that on my future missions to America I shan't be mistaken for an Englishman. In this video, I'll be giving a short form version of the argument that I made at length in 4 videos in my series, The Actual Cause of Political Correctness, parts 1 through 4. So to begin here and explain how political correctness originated. If, at any time in human history, we see the emergence of a new ideology, whether religious or secular, one of the first questions we should ask is, was state violence used to help that ideology start? Or once it was started, to maintain it? In order to answer that question, let's look at 4 major historical ideologies, 2 religious and 2 secular, to see the answer. Christianity, Islam, fascism, and communism. Now, it's true that Christianity started voluntarily, but once it became the Roman state religion in 380 AD, it used violence to stifle other religions, and even later turned into the Spanish, Roman, and Portuguese Inquisitions to persecute heretics and non-believers. Habitual pogroms of those disbelieving Jews? Check. The Catholic Church obtaining huge amounts of monies through tithes and indulgences? Check. To fund their religious indoctrination of children and adults through convents, schools, monasteries, and universities? Check. Slaughtering all manner of people who disagreed, like North and South American Indians, Balts, Slavs, and heretics of all sorts? Burning them at the stake? Check. Now Islam. Did Muhammad and Muslims throughout history use violence in spreading and maintaining their religion? Are you hoaxing me? Islam spread from Mecca throughout much of the known world, overwhelmingly by brutal wars of conquest. Of North Africa and Spain, which had previously been Christian, of Asia Minor, which had previously been Zoroastrian, and of India, which had been Hindu. Did they leave out perhaps the Buddhists? No, they conquered Buddhists too, those who lived along the ancient trade route of the Silk Road. And once Islam had conquered and raped and slaughtered and enslaved, it imposed highly discriminatory laws of all kinds on dhimmi populations, of taxation, of the reduction in all kinds of civil liberties, and by the forced spread of Islamic religious ideology, such as through mosques and schools and universities. Of course, in general society, blasphemy, denying the truth of Islamic dogma, was outlawed from the beginning and stringently punished then as today, and death for apostasy is still in the books in 13 Muslim countries as of 2017. So was force used to spread Muslim beliefs? Yes. That's basically how Islam spread. Now let's turn to secular ideologies, that of fascism. Would anyone deny that Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy used all manner of state coercion to spread and maintain their ideologies? Even quasi-fascist or authoritarian leaders, such as Perón in Argentina, Metaxas in Greece, or Franco in Spain, borrowed at times from fascistic methods, such as in nationalizing broadcasting, closing newspapers, imprisoning dissidents or opposition leaders, using forced labor in concentration camps, and, in the case of Franco, simply slaughtering tens of thousands of his opponents in the White Terror. So was force used to spread fascistic belief? Finally, communism. Was state violence used historically to spread Soviet, Maoist, and Cuban commie propaganda? To ask the question is to answer it. Why did Solzhenitsyn write The Gulag Archipelago? Why did Chinese American Fan Chen write Gang of One, Memoirs of a Red Guard? And why Cuban American Armando Valladares, Against All Hope, a memoir of life in Castro's Gulag? Because the method of communism in propaganda, as in all else, is pure violence. When we then turn to modern times and the example of Xi Jinping's communist China, we find hitherto unequaled attempts to suppress the truth and elevate lies in its place. Tiananmen Square, gone from Sino-cyberspace. Xi Jinping as Winnie the Pooh, a delightful meme only shared and enjoyed outside of mainland China. The attempts by heroic Dr. Li Wenliang to warn his countrymen about the dangers of the developing COVID-19 pandemic, ignored or condemned, and other subsequent whistleblowers silenced or disappeared. COVID as having been created in the US and transported to an innocent China, a conspiracy theory which gained surprising traction behind the Great Firewall. Suppression of the facts that China is engaging in genocide of the Uyghurs and Tibetans, and on and on. The constant drumbeat and creation of self-serving or nationalistic narratives also used across the border in North Korea, where those who have escaped, like Yeonmi Park, give detailed testimony as to how well totalitarian regimes suppress information and glorify the personhood and alleged accomplishments of their dictatorship, just as China did with Mao and increasingly does with Xi. So what has this survey of these four ideologies, two religious and two secular, shown us? Exactly what I said, that state coercion and violence, in other words, the pure violation or disregard of property rights, can be used either to start or maintain self-deceptive belief systems, ideologies. Now, if that's the case, the obvious question is, did this happen in the US? With regard to the rise of political correctness and its intensification, wokeness? And the answer is clearly, yes, it did. It was the American use of violence, in other words, the violation of property rights with regard to higher education, that damaged our universities so much that, in their weakened state, they were easy prey to all sorts of bad ideologies, political correctness being one. In other words, the doctrine of political correctness, the doctrines have colonized U.S. universities precisely because of the governmental influence on them. And that governmental influence has been expressed over the course of a century in three key forms. Number one, the first way is the fact that Americans don't, in the case of private colleges, completely directly fund higher education, which means that these colleges get lots of tax exemptions on the normal taxes they should pay. Exemptions on property tax, income tax, capital gains, and others. This means that they are in effect partially subsidized by the state and thus are an educational version of crony capitalism. In the case of public universities, they are also partially funded by the state, first through tax legislation, and secondly, as with private colleges, by the financial aid from the government given to students. The net result of these tax privileges and public funding is that these institutions become weakened intellectually because they are not directly subject to the values and the knowledge and thus the control of us, the public, when they grow and develop. Now, if we look at the fast food industry, say McDonald's, it gives us exactly the type of burgers we want because we are paying directly for those burgers. McDonald's knows that if it doesn't give us what we want, it will go out of business. But this is precisely not the case with tax-exempt private colleges or with public state universities. They give us what they want to give us, which is wokeness, because they're in many ways not directly subject to our funding control. Number two, the second prime reason for the rise of political correctness is the huge increase in federal monies since World War II given to public and private colleges, both by subsidizing them directly and through governmental student aid. What was the result of this flood of federal monies? To create huge numbers of politically correct departments in the humanities: Black studies, white studies, diversity studies, fat studies, queer studies, disability studies, and increasingly portions in the normal humanities, such as English, anthropology, sociology, history, and psychology, that represent the views of our ideological enemies. This flood of federal money received, in combination with their tax exemptions and third-party financing, meant that our colleges, both public and private, had become factories of politically correct ideologies and thus engines of propaganda and disinformation. Finally, the last reason, number 3, and that is Titles 7 and 9 of the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1991, which violate our civil liberties by the threat of huge legal fines on or bankruptcy of businesses, colleges, and governmental departments if we don't follow the racist and sexist treatment of non-blacks and males they mandate. The modern workplace and classrooms and governmental departments are forced by various affirmative action bureaucracies and disparate impact court judgments to actively suppress and punish the normal civil liberties of speech and freedom of association that we as Americans possess. And this effect is a secondary or follow-on effect that came from the universities once they had already been weakened and colonized by PC ideas previously. Thus, the origins of political correctness in the United States. How did it happen again? To summarize: by tax exemptions to private colleges, the third-party financing of public universities, the stealing of huge amounts of federal monies from taxpayers to give to these universities, with which they created the ideologies seen everywhere today, and secondarily by Titles 7 and 9 of the Civil Rights Acts, which enforced behavioral racism and sexism. Having thus explained the origins of political correctness, and by implication how to destroy it, I bid you well and shall finish my tea.